Relyea is an associate professor in art theory and practice at Northwestern University and the editor-in-chief of Art Journal. His essays and reviews have appeared in numerous magazines, including Artforum, Afterall, Parkett, Frieze, Modern Painters, Art in America, and Flash Art. He has written monographs on Polly Apfelbaum, Richard Artschwager, Jeremy Blake, Vija Celmins, Toba Khedoori, Monique Prieto, and Wolfgang Tillmans, among others, and contributed to such exhibition catalogs as Helter, Skelter, and public offerings. He has delivered lectures at New York's Museum of Modern Art, Harvard University, and the Art Institute of Chicago, among other venues. After teaching for a decade at the California Institute of the Arts in Valencia, where he joined the faculty in 1991, in the summer of 2001, he was appointed director of the core program in art history at the Glassell School of Art in Houston, Texas. His most recent book, Your Everyday Art World, was published in 2013. Lane is a familiar face on campus to many after filling in for Heather during her sabbatical last spring. On behalf of Cranbrook Planning, please welcome Lane Relyea.
Hi, everybody, especially hi second years. I'm back. Thank you, Aunt. I know. Thanks, Hannah, for the introduction and for all the help, and also James and Tori, thanks for your help. And of course, special thanks to Bev and Cranbrook Painting. I'm going to try something a little bit different from what I've done in the past when I've lectured here, which is that I'm going to try to do something like a traditional art history lecture, which means, for one thing, that I'm going to start with the classic art historical teaching method of the dual slide comparison. But the items that I want to juxtapose at the start here are not two artworks, but rather I'm going to compare and contrast two pieces of texts, two quotes, to be exact. Okay, so here's the first quote. And this is coming from Josephine Rydberg Dumont, who was the managing director of IKEA of Sweden up until I think about 2005. Okay, so we might begin by asking of this first quote, which modernism is she talking about? Most likely, we would assume that Rydberg Dumont is referring to mid-century international style design, the furniture of Saarinen and Bertoia and Eames and Nelson and so on. Certainly, she doesn't mean this, right? The kind of inward-turned, formally austere, snooty abstract art in which the medium's constituent components and overall essential nature are laid bare. Or perhaps, could it be that she's referring to both? That her concept of modernism twines together a variety of its conflicting impulses, including the fear as well as the dream of merging art and life. A capacious, self-differing portrait of modernism. That's what I'm going to assume the managing director of IKEA has in mind, if only for argument's sake. And that's because my argument is in part this. I think an enormous range of artists today, Polly Apfelbaum here, Katharina Grosse, Marilyn Minter, Laura Owens, Wolfgang Tillmans, Christopher Wool, many, many others, make beautiful abstract work that doesn't seem particularly bent or in need of autonomy. Apfelbaum lays her art often on the floor like a rug, or here like a quilt on top of a bed. Katharina Grosse paints on exterior as well as interior building walls. Both Minter and Tillmans, this is Wolfgang Tillmans, link abstraction to fashion and glamour and celebrity. Chris Wool marries spray can vandalism with wallpaper. Moreover, most all of the works by these artists would look perfectly swell hanging over the living room couch. This is art, in other words, that accommodates contingencies, that feeds off of rather than tries to stand aloof from both the chaos and the quietude of everyday life. This is a West Elm catalog from about 10 years ago, but can you guys see the Christopher Wool in there? The float like a butterfly, sting like a bee piece? Just now miniaturized and in this just gigantic black frame. Anyways, maybe this isn't also new. Maybe it's always been the case. Back in the early and mid-60s, for example, Morris Louis was simultaneously credited with manifesting the real and parading the artificial. Some critics, of course, dismissed his paintings as mere decorations. Harold Rosenberg, for one, wrote that, quote, "Never before has mere decoration been presented with more pretentiousness and remained mere decoration." At about the very same time, though, the artist Robert Morris claimed that, compared to Jackson Pollock, Louis was, quote, "even closer to matter in his use of the container itself to pour the fluid paint out." An altogether different interpretive direction was offered by the critic Max Kozlov, who wrote that, quote, "Only the most devoted admirers of the formalist persuasion have continued not to see in such works the impassioned and inflated reference, indeed the enactment of orgasm." Lawrence Alloway complained aloud about how often post-war abstraction was interpreted as orgiastic and indulgent, with critics describing it as ejaculatory and rococo. So much so that Alloway felt the need to soberly insist on the formalist reading that, quote, "In fact, sensuality in painting is simply absorption with the specialized means of the artists, the painter's liquids and pastes, and the handling of these has nothing to do with bedrooms and boudoirs," end quote. Now, if you go back to the 50s, even before the rise of the color-filled work of Lewis and Nolan and Nowitzki, you find similar examples. Life magazine, for instance, famously rendered its own conflicted characterization of stain painting. In one issue, the magazine featured Jackson Pollock, Jack the Dribbler, dressed in workers' dungarees and furiously employing the stain as a means of exploring and liberating the very frontiers of art. A few years later, though, Life turned its lens on Helen Frankenthaler's studio, this time posing her faced away from her art and towards the camera, this time also decking the artist out in a fashionable skirt and blouse and full makeup. Furthermore, she's shown not working on, but actually sitting atop one of her floor-bound canvases. Life magazine seems to be saying here that stain painting makes history when wielded by a man, while for a woman it makes a cushy throw rug, a domestic accessory. But maybe even the earliest and most influential critic champions of modernist painting, this guy, also saw the issue as never straightforward, as always multi-layered and contradictory. Yes, on the one hand, by releasing paint and color from the constraints of line and figuration, large-scale color abstraction marked the triumphant apogee of post-war American art, that moment when painting reached its historical destination and clinched its immaculate flatness. But perhaps the opposite is also true, that such painting was also intended for a completely different destination, that its fulfillment could only be achieved by gaining acceptance into modern domestic interiors, which is to say, its goal was precisely to go well with the couch. Okay, so now for the second quote. And who is this from? Well, of course, okay. This is not IKEA's Rydberg de Mont talking. It's Clement Greenberg, who in 1949 also thought we were finally ready for modernism. Now, we know that modern and contemporary art history teaches us insistently that, in the words of Benjamin Buchloh, quote, reference to architecture in any form, whatever, would have been unthinkable in the context of American-type formalism and abstract expressionism, end quote. This kind of idea has become an article of faith. It gets repeated over and over. Indeed, the fact that Greenberg became so deeply concerned from the late 40s through much of the 1950s with the social life of art is seldom acknowledged, even after about 1960 by Greenberg himself. But in no way does it excuse Greenberg's many failings to acknowledge that, at least until the late 1950s, he was a beat critic, writing about art as it happened, and that he therefore repeatedly had to adjust his thinking as the evaluative criteria he was using succumbed one after another to changing conditions. And yet the certainty of his writing tone, his rhetorical style, generated an overwhelming tendency to attribute to him doctrinaire positions remaining unchanged over his entire career. The unfortunate result of all this is not just a flattening and stereotyping of Greenberg. Much more worrisome is the gross oversimplification of the long and very complex history through which he and his cultural production had to pass. So let me take a moment here to fill in some of that complex history. After World War II, Greenberg realized that with all the devastation making it difficult for Europe to continue supporting advanced painting and sculpture, that responsibility would now fall to New York. Greenberg wrote in 1947 that, quote, "The task facing culture in America is to create a milieu that will produce such an art." 3 years later, while collaborating with Meyer Shapiro in selecting artists for a group show at the Sam Coots Gallery titled New Talent 1950, Greenberg wrote about how, quote, "The artist functions best in the company of other artists. Art is an intensely social product and suffers in the long run under isolation." The list of participants Greenberg and Shapiro chose for the Coots show is striking for its diversity. Over 24 youngish artists of differing styles making work both large and small, embracing both figuration and abstraction. This is Larry Rivers and Fairfield Porter, two of the participants. "Talent," Greenberg wrote, quote, "is borne up, swept along, and extended to its full by collective inspiration," end quote. Now, another part of Greenberg's story that often gets completely overlooked is how difficult it was and how long it took for him to feel comfortable supporting what would come to be known as color field painting. Indeed, around the same time as the New Talent show at the Coots Gallery, the critic actually talked about giving up on painting altogether. And the source of his displeasure was none other than modernist painting's increasing flatness. So again, I know this sounds like probably I'm lying or something, but this is true. So let me just explain. What so many scholars and critics take as Greenberg's emblem of purity was, in fact, originally, for that critic, a treacherously two-sided phenomenon. On the one hand, Greenberg thought that, quote, "To restore the identity of an art, the opacity of its medium must be emphasized," end quote. But at the same time, he also realized that, quote, "Painting of a kind that identifies itself exclusively with its surface cannot help but develop towards decoration," end quote. The idea here is that the material identity of painting, flatness, seemed to be at odds with its historical identity, that is, its function as an easel picture. Instead of aligning itself with the plane of the wall, Greenberg explained, quote, "The form of the easel picture cuts an illusion of a box-like cavity into the wall behind it." But easel painting did more than just detach itself from its surroundings. The easel painting format modeled nothing less than individuality. That's why the early modern, or the early Renaissance moderns, required painting to differentiate itself from stained glass windows, from manuscript illuminations, and from church frescoes. As Greenberg tells the story, quote, "The magnates and clerical bureaucrats of Flanders found in framed pictures a proper means by which to celebrate themselves publicly in their character as individuals, for the framed picture spoke for itself and was not to be subordinated to its architectural surroundings in the role of mere decoration." So the logic here is somewhat simple. The pictorial structure of traditional easel painting is built on the individual's line of sight, right? The line that extends from the viewer's eyes past the plane of the frame of the picture and the plane of the wall, and towards the vanishing point nested at the farthest reaches of the painting's illusory space. Postward abstraction turned that axis 90 degrees, right? Not that way, but this way. It extended itself perpendicular to the viewer's sight line, like the wall itself. Such flat pictures started to show up in New York around 1944, the year Pagan Guggenheim first showed Janet Sobel, who made swirling abstractions by tipping canvases to slide around the still wet paint. And the Willard Gallery debuted Mark Tobey, whose technique of white writing interlaced calligraphic brushwork into evenly spread, densely meshed rectangles of paint. Around the same time, Guggenheim also commissioned Jackson Pollock to make a painting, the 20-foot-long mural, to cover the wall of the foyer to her new Manhattan townhouse. As the 50s neared, more and more New York artists joined in, and many would prove that nothing limited the dimensions of this new kind of painting except the literal size of the rooms they occupied. Flatness mandated that pictures expand to the scale of architecture. As Greenberg described it at the time, the results were canvases that act like, quote, wallpaper patterns capable of being extended indefinitely. Greenberg traced the most immediate precedents of this new work to Impressionism. Whereas Cubism was easel painting's highest achievement, according to Greenberg, quote, since Impressionism, painting in Western Europe and America has been engaged in unraveling its own tradition, end quote. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, Greenberg would chart the New York School's development through this opposition between Cubism's frame-bound structure and Impressionism's indiscriminate color texture. And he often framed this binary in culture versus nature or active versus passive terms, as well as along gender lines. Impressionist painting was, he said, formless. Monet, for example, quote, offered the mere texture of color as adequate form in painting, forgetting that art is relations, not matter, for all matter can do is repeat itself, end quote. Another kind of not so hidden gender reference. For Greenberg, if there was an artist whose work still embodied a thriving Cubist idiom in the late 1940s, it was not a painter at all, but rather the sculptor David Smith. In Smith's welded metal constructions, Greenberg saw an allegiance between Cubist structure and what he felt was a much-needed cultural expression of masculinity. Smith's virile elegance, Greenberg wrote, is without example in a country where elegance is otherwise obtained only by femininity or by a wistful, playful, derivative kind of decorativeness. This masculine anxiety moment was precisely when Greenberg considered abandoning his advocacy of painting altogether and throwing in his lot with sculpture. To his mind, quote, we shall no longer be able to rely upon painting as largely as we used to for visual ordering of our experience. But sculpture has lately undergone a transformation that seems to endow it with a greater range of expression for modern sensibility than painting has now. What helped give for Greenberg the new sculpture an advantage was its greater capacity to help reconcile advanced art on some practical level with middle-class industrial society. With its blood ties to engineering and architecture, sculpture seemed to point the way beyond many of the impasses Greenberg had been running up against. Such sculpture was built up rather than spread out. It handled large scale in a manner that was virile and masculine rather than passive and dissipating. It, quote, attaches itself more intimately to industrialism than any other form of art now being practiced. Moreover, in its allegiance to structure and line over formless color and texture, the sculpture reconvened Cubism's insistence on the frame, even if it was a frame blown up to the size of a room, standing halfway between architectural frames and the frame of easel painting. The new sculptural constructions negotiated between a pictorial inside and the real industrial world outside. They were framed at once pictorial and, to quote Greenberg again, as palpable and independent and present as the houses we live in and the furniture we use. So, counting on sculpture rather than painting to lead the way, Greenberg throughout the early 1950s spoke much more cheerfully about advanced art's future. He repeated the story of how all the modern arts were united, how they all grew out of Cubism insofar as Cubism gave birth to collage, which in turn morphed into bas-relief, before finally giving way to constructivism, of which abstract sculpture and international style architecture and design were the furthest developments at present. This dream of a grand synthesis of all the different branches of visual art was in fact crucial to Greenberg's eventual acceptance of color field painting. Here he finally decided color field abstraction had at last found a home, not just figuratively, but literally. The new Cubist-derived architecture and sculpture would encase and orient its wallpaper-like abstract paintings, and a sense of the detached and detaching frame would thereby be retrieved on a heroic scale. Art would reform society rather than be co-opted by it, because it would re-enter the social matrix not as feminine decor, but as masculine grand style. Greenberg declared triumphantly that, quote, of all the arts, the new pictorial or constructivist sculpture relates best to American decor, understands it best, and would affect it most directly, end quote. To Greenberg's eye, a merger of art and life was indeed on the horizon. Until the 1940s, the question of finding an adequate social destination for advanced art was usually answered with a political prophecy. Such a home was part of the promise of socialism. But with that promise seemingly extinguished by World War II, a more pragmatic home came into focus. An actual architecture, or lack thereof, became an issue of paramount importance. And not just for Greenberg. Throughout the late 1940s and early 50s, artists, museums, galleries, architectural firms, and furniture designers engaged in myriad interactions with the aim of infusing everyday life with a material infrastructure grounded in its own consistent logic, obeying its own immanent laws, and informed by modern industrialism and technology, but not reducible to them. Quote, a bland, large, balanced, Apollonian art, as Greenberg put it, resting on rationality, but without permitting itself to be rationalized, end quote. In the exhibition season of 1948-1949, 12 different US museums mounted shows dedicated to applied design. The Museum of Modern Art opened painting and sculpture in architecture, an exhibition of photographs documenting the deployment of avant-garde art within modern architectural settings. And outside, in the museum's sculpture garden, MoMA installed a new modern house designed by Marcel Breuer. Soon after that, it mounted Modern Art in Your Life. And a few months later, the museum launched its 4-year run of good design shows, with the director of the museum proclaiming, quote, of every 100 persons who come to the museum, we estimate that no more than 10 actually accept a geometric abstraction by Piet Mondrian. But when principles of good design permeate a home, the occupants tend to be more tolerant, more receptive to the new ideas in art. Also, artists, by and large, put aside whatever antagonisms they might have held towards society and participated in this trend. At the same time that MoMA was showing the painting and sculpture and architecture show, Jackson Pollock opened an exhibition at the Betty Parsons Gallery that included the architectural model and ideal museum. That's him and his collaborator, the architect Peter Blake, looking at the model. Let's see. This is the magazine. Oh, I don't have my notes here. Anyways, I forget which architectural magazine doing a write-up about that model by Pollock and Peter Blake. The following year after this, Pollock confirmed in an interview that given the work of, quote, 5 or 6 of my contemporaries in New York, the direction that painting seems to be taking here is away from the easel into some kind of wall painting. Pollock further enthused about his recent attempts at painting on glass, which he found, quote, very exciting. I think the possibility of using painting on glass in modern architecture, in modern construction, is terrific. This is the famous painting that he makes at the end of the film by Hans Nemeth on him. And so the camera, Nemeth's camera, is directed at Pollock from behind the glass, kind of under the glass, as Pollock dribbles things onto the top of the glass from above. Here's a picture of that very piece being shown at MoMA as part of an exhibition of Pollock's kind of like, 1950 great paintings. It's the thing on the stand there in the corner. Also in 1950, Mark Rothko's number 8, measuring 8 feet tall, was featured in a Vogue magazine pictorial spread touting large-scale painting as an interior decorating trend. Among Manhattan dealers, it was Sam Coots again who worked most aggressively to forge ties between the new art and architecture, including a show he mounted titled Modern Painting for a Country Estate, Important Painting for Spacious Living, as well as these projects that he solicited from leading architects, including Brewer, Walter Gropius, Philip Johnson, and Frederick Kiesler. Other galleries followed suit, like the Martha Jackson Gallery and its show, The Enormous Room, and even Greenberg himself got involved, not just cheerleading from the sidelines, but actually helping to arrange deals and push product. Over the course of the 1950s, he curated a total of 13 gallery and museum exhibitions, and from 1958 to 1960, he famously served as a paid consultant to the French & Company Gallery. Greenberg's influence on French & Company, which was a former bastion of like old French furnishings and antiques, is reflected in this gallery ad that ran in Arts magazine, in which a David Smith sculpture on the far right is propped alongside a Gothic caisson over which hangs a painting by Joel Zalitsky. Okay, this widespread campaign to nurture patronage among the American middle class did make significant headway, but not without difficulty. When key New York collectors did begin buying oversized canvases, it usually required that they entirely reconstruct their homes. So this is the slide I showed you earlier. It's Ben Hiller's apartment on the Upper East Side. This was kind of like the most covered example where Heller hired the architects Kramer and Kramer to overhaul his Manhattan apartment so that it could fit paintings like Pollock's number 1, which measured 9 by 17 feet. Galleries, too, had similar problems. In 1959, for example, Kenneth Nolan had to leave the Tibor Donaghey Gallery because his new concentric paintings couldn't fit inside the building's doorways. Too many gigantic paintings were being made relative to the number of rooms big enough to accommodate them. Indeed, William Rubin wrote to Morris Louis after his French & Company show in 1959 that, quote, "You are quite aware that your exclusive commitment to outsized canvases has made it extremely difficult to sell your work," end quote. By the end of the 1950s, Greenberg's enthusiasm for this idea of a grand new period style overtaking industrial America began to wane. Over the course of the decade, and partly due to earlier museum advocacy and publicity, interior design became big business. As it was increasingly mass-marketed, initiative passed from the hands of architects, engineers, and designers to consumers themselves. The 1956 Complete Book of Interior Decorating advised readers, quote, "Don't be afraid to give expression to your own taste in making your selections. It's your home," end quote. Public architectural commissions seemed to suffer as well. At least Greenberg felt that most commissions were being granted to inferior artists. Quote, "The most conspicuous result of the diffusion of the use of the welding torch among American sculptors has been a superior kind of garden statuary and a new, oversized kind of objet d'art. 10 years ago, hopes were bright for sculpture. These hopes have faded. Despite sculpture having rescued painting just as the crisis of the easel picture had reached its peak, nevertheless, once Greenberg's sense of that crisis had abated, he began to appreciate color-field canvases for their opticality. He felt sculpture services were no longer needed. Now there was no advantage for him to sculptures being as palpable as the furniture. Plus, yet another problem surfaced, namely the Neo-Dada work that began finding an audience in New York at the very end of the 1950s. The year 1958 began with Jasper Johns enjoying his first solo show in New York and making the cover of Art News, with Robert Rauschenberg's Combines at Leo Castelli and Alan Caprow's Happenings, which I'm showing you here, at the Hansa Gallery, and with Newsweek reporting on the anti-art trend. Artists like Caprow and Rauschenberg seemed to usurp the idea of, as David Smith had put it, quote, combining painting and sculpture into a new art form that would beat either one, end quote. The lessons the Neo-Dadaists took from Cubist collage deviated radically from the rational grand style of international architecture and design. Junk, not engineering, became the operative term. It was a conspiracy theory that Irving Sandler articulated in 1960 in what sounds like a nightmare rewrite of Greenberg's historical narrative. Sandler writes, quote, the metal constructions of David Smith have been especially influential on the work of the Neo-Dadas. The line between painting and sculpture gets so blurred that Neo-Dada construction collages are most fittingly called objects. The sides of abstract expressionist paintings, particularly those of Pollock, their assault upon the viewer, the picture as environment, has stimulated Caprow, Red Grooms, Klaus Oldenburg, Whitman and Dine, and others to create actual environments. These artists have transformed the entire gallery space into a stage set, end quote. The vision of a rationally integrated and ennobling modernist style had indeed ignited this backlash in the form of irrational environments, chicken wire and plastic tarp hovels, and an overall trash aesthetic. Industrialism was on the wane by now, and now we would find that form followed dysfunction. This was an art governed not by rationality, but by disposability and obsolescence. And rather than being imperviously centered on its own immanent principles, it was theatrical, eventful, and spectacular. A few years later, Caprow would smile over such a turn of events. Quote, at one time, modern art on its way from the gallery to the museum stopped off at the collector's home, and there it looked out of place because it was lived with, he said. Now it's the reverse, kitchen sink art, pop, common object art, assemblage, junk culture, rearrangeables, multiples, environments, all are united in their appeal to and often literal involvement in the themes and spaces of daily existence, and they appear absurd and out of kilter in museums where they cannot be lived with, end quote. Okay, so that's the history. Now, as a way to conclude, I want to say a few words about it. First, just to be clear, when Greenberg used the words feminine and decorative to describe an artwork, he definitely intended it, of course, as a slur, especially given the period's still ongoing adjustments to peacetime realities. Such machismo probably had a populist ring, and so it was also a cheap shot. And it was lazy. More was involved in Greenberg's preoccupation with and worrying over domesticity, decor, and decoration. At a time when it seemed no amount of revision could save his attempts at a convincing theory of medium specificity, he transferred his hopes onto a broad vision of culture per se, in which all the arts fused into one coherent period style through the power of a single underlying belief system. Moderns would have their own consistent integrated culture in much the same way as the Carolingians had theirs. For modern age mass society, this kind of common belief system could be located in scientific rationalism, which found its clearest, fullest manifestation in the plastic arts via 20th century sculpture, architecture, and design. But a problem arose when abstract painting refused to play along. And for Greenberg, that refusal took two different forms. Abstract painting expressed either too little or too much independence. On the one hand, it was so flat and undifferentiated that it blended in only by ceding to external limitations, like, say, the length of a wall, as well as by relinquishing attention to the other more dramatic points of interest provided by nearby furniture or objets or lighting arrangements. On the other hand, it could continue to stand out as a separate entity only if it retained some of easel painting's traditional pictorial structure. That is, if it still had some of the feel and spatial ambiguity of representation, no matter how large and abstract it was. The result was either deferral to contingencies and conformity, or else eclecticism and dispersion resulting from too many personal and competing expressions and viewpoints. These would be the two options of what culture might look like when it lacked this paternal disciplining of an authoritative, overarching belief system. And this is exactly what abstract painting kept in play as alternatives to Greenberg's narrative of a burgeoning culture of bland, balanced, and Apollonian rationality. Okay, so almost a half century has passed since that moment. And once again, the social destination of art confronts us as a paramount concern. We have relational aesthetics and social practice, and again, artists who gesture towards a grand integrated style. For example, the fusing of architecture and design and art in the works of Liam Gillick and Jorge Pardo and Andrea Zattel and others. But the question still remains, what kind of modernism is this? Is it about the home or the stage? Is it about period style or personal style or lifestyle? Is it about a culture centered on its own immanent logic or a culture of distraction and disposability? Thanks. This is actually the continuation of the Rydberg-Dumont quote. We don't think we're going to live one way always. Our feeling is it's just furniture. Change it. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember those IKEA commercials of the people crying over throwing away their old belongings. No? This one guy takes his old lamp out, puts it on the street corner by the garbage cans, and he's crying. And this person emerges from the shadows, who's all blonde-haired and blue-eyed, Swedish, and says, "Don't feel bad for it." And then, like, boom, is the IKEA logo, and then this spelling of unboring that has an umlaut over the O. Perhaps this is one reason why it's so hard to feel at home with modernism, because it entails all these things. And that's not to mention the wide range of barely social, creaturely necessities, the bodily functions and intimate interactions that collect in the home and make our everyday lives exceedingly non-Apollonian. Modernism, because it entails so many contradictions and so little capacity to resolve them, may be something we'll never quite be ready for. If a lot of artists today choose to leave such tensions unresolved, it's not always to avoid the issue. Often it's because they want to engage it all the more broadly. Yes, stain paintings still get made, and some are put up for sale and bought and hung over someone's sofa. Some of these works by Apfelbaum or Owens, for example, will recall landscapes and still lifes, but just as often suggest pratfalls and pie fights and other slapstick routines. Still others by Grossa, Minter, Wool will evoke crime scenes, toxic spells, bloodstains, crash sites, body traumas. Regardless, all will likely go well with not only the sofa, but everything else in the house. And I mean everything, including the pet hair and soap scum and the stains in the rug that won't ever come out. It'll go with that pleasurably distracted feeling of casually sitting around, doing nothing, or lying in bed or in the bath an extra 10 minutes, even if it means being late for work. But it will also go with the upside-down mortgage and the fact that 1 in 5 households now move every year. It'll go with the punk rock playing on the stereo, the police raids that pass as entertainment on TV, and the NSA listening in on your phone. It'll go with the worries that you have about using regular tap water to clean and cook your food. This is modernism. Welcome home. Thanks.